Judge Grayson believed he was sentencing a naive teenager, but the defendant skillfully unraveled the case like a practiced attorney. The atmosphere inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse felt heavy, nearly stifling. The gallery was packed with spectators murmuring as they observed the unfolding scene. The defendant's table seemed oversized for the young man standing beside it, hands in his pockets, chin raised just enough to show he wasn't intimidated. Jalen Dawson, 19, faced charges of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The accusations were serious, but the way Judge Walter Grayson studied him suggested the real trial went beyond legal matters. Leaning back in his chair, fingers idly drumming on his polished wooden desk, Grayson peered at Jalen over his glasses. His lips twisted into a smirk, barely concealing his condescension. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" he asked, his tone laced with amusement. "This isn't a debate club, kid." Laughter rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff, stenographer, and even the prosecutor joined in. Jalen, however, remained unfazed. He wasn't laughing. He had spent years preparing, though not for this exact moment. He never expected to stand here as a defendant, but he knew the courtroom as well as his own home. While other kids memorized sports stats, Jalen studied case law. While his friends played video games, he reenacted mock trials in his mind, arguing both sides. His mother, Denise Dawson, had been a paralegal for over 20 years, and Jalen absorbed every story she shared. He learned how prosecutors cut corners, how judges showed bias, and how some defense attorneys barely put up a fight. By 14, he could deconstruct a trial better than most law students. But none of that mattered to Grayson. To him, Jalen was just another troubled youth. The judge sighed, flipping open the case file. "Let's make this quick. I have a golf game at 2. Laughter filled the room again. But this time, something shifted. Jalen's lips curled into a subtle smirk. Grayson had just made his first mistake, though no one else had noticed. Mitchell Carrington, the prosecutor, stood with the confidence of a man certain he had already won. His suit was immaculate, his tie perfectly knotted, and his voice carried the polished ease of someone who had delivered the same speech countless times before. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Jalen Dawson, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle, a 2022 Audi A6, reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The evidence speaks for itself." The weight of his words settled over the courtroom. The gallery murmured, shifting in their seats. On the surface, the case seemed airtight: stolen car, police chase, attempted escape. Judge Grayson glanced at Jalen before turning back to Carrington. "Go on." The prosecutor stepped toward the jury box, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "The defense may argue this was a misunderstanding, that Mr. Dawson is simply an unfortunate victim of circumstance." He turned, locking eyes with Jalen for the first time. "But let's be honest. What kind of victim runs from the police?" The tension in the room deepened. Grayson leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. Jalen remained motionless, unblinking. Carrington continued, flipping through a stack of documents. "Your Honor, I have here the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally saw the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. The vehicle was confirmed stolen. The arrest was by the book." Grayson exhaled through his nose and nodded. "Sounds straightforward to me." For most people in the room, it did. A stolen car. A chase. An arrest. An open and shut case. But Jalen had spent too many years analyzing trials not to see the flaws. He remained silent, watching, waiting. Judge Grayson gave a light tap of his gavel. "All right, let's hear the defense's argument." He shifted his gaze to Jalen's lawyer, Lisa Thornton, a public defender who had barely spoken since entering the courtroom. She stood hesitantly, adjusting her posture. "Your Honor, my client." Jalen touched her arm gently, a silent request. She paused, then sank back into her chair as Jalen spoke for the first time. "I'll represent myself, Your Honor." Silence swept across the room. Grayson regarded him, clearly intrigued. "You'll what?" Jalen's voice remained steady and composed. "I'll be handling my own defense." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The bailiff's eyebrows lifted. Carrington's smirk faltered momentarily before he let out a short laugh. This should be interesting. But the laughter faded as Jalen stepped forward because everything was about to shift. The weight of the courtroom pressed on Jalen as he adjusted his stance, hands still in his pockets. He let the silence stretch, enough to make them uneasy. Then he spoke. "Your Honor, before I begin, I want to confirm something with the prosecution." Carrington crossed his arms, raising an eyebrow. "Go ahead." Jalen took a measured step forward. "You stated that Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before my arrest, correct?" Carrington exhaled sharply, already unimpressed. "That's right. And that statement is in his report." "Of course it is." Jalen nodded, then turned to Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, I request that testimony be dismissed as evidence." Grayson narrowed his eyes. "On what basis?" Jalen pulled his hands from his pockets and gestured toward the prosecution's table. "Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began." A flicker of confusion crossed Carrington's face. "What are you talking about?" Jalen stepped forward again. "Your Honor, if permitted, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report claims he saw me, his location history should confirm that. But he let the word hang. I have a feeling it won't." Murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Grayson frowned, looking toward Carrington. "Counselor." Carrington cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. "That report was filed by a law enforcement officer, Your Honor. Are we really going to trust the defendant's word over a trained officer's?" Jalen offered a small, casual shrug. "If the officer was where he said, the GPS data will confirm it. If he wasn't—" He let the thought trail off. Grayson studied him before turning to Carrington. "Does the prosecution object to verifying the officer's GPS logs?" Carrington hesitated. The pause was just long enough. The jury noticed. The gallery noticed. Most importantly, the judge noticed. Jalen took a quiet breath. He had spent years observing trials, analyzing prosecutors, their tactics, their strategies. And one thing was certain, if Carrington had confidence in his case, he wouldn't be stalling. Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple. "Counselor." Carrington finally shook his head. "No objections, Your Honor." But the shift had already begun. For the first time, no one was laughing. The courtroom remained silent, yet the tension filled the air. Carrington shuffled his papers, his polished confidence beginning to crack. "Your Honor, while we await the GPS records, the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle." Jalen nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. "That's true." He stepped forward. "But let's examine that evidence." Grayson raised an eyebrow, motioning for him to continue. Jalen turned to the jury, meeting their eyes. "The prosecution wants you to believe that my fingerprints in a car mean I stole it. That's their story. But let's think logically." He took a deep breath, keeping his tone controlled. "Say you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You slide your hands into the pockets, zip it up, then put it back. Later, someone steals that jacket. Do your fingerprints prove you took it?" A few jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery muttered something under their breath. Jalen didn't let them recover. The car was parked outside 7 to 11 hours before it was reportedly stolen. "I was inside that store with 3 friends. When we passed the car, I leaned on it. I even opened the door. Because it was already unlocked. I didn't think much of it. I didn't take the car. Didn't drive it. Didn't steal from it. Just a dumb moment of curiosity." He let that sit in the air for a moment. Then, with a voice as sharp as a scalpel, he asked, "Does touching something make you a criminal?" Carrington cleared his throat, flipping through notes, searching for something, anything, to regain control. Jalen wasn't finished. "Since we're on the subject, let's discuss the fingerprint analysis." He turned to Grayson. "Your Honor, was the forensic specialist in this case subpoenaed to testify?" Grayson blinked, caught off guard. He glanced at Carrington. The prosecutor hesitated, then admitted, "No." Jalen pressed his lips together. "So let me get this straight. The state is using forensic evidence against me, yet they didn't find it necessary to bring in the expert who analyzed it. No chance for cross-examination. No way to ask about the chain of custody or challenge its accuracy. Carrington's jaw tightened. Jalen nodded, like that was all he needed to hear. Interesting. Judge Grayson sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. He looked like a man realizing this case wasn't the easy win he had expected. But Jalen wasn't done. What he was about to say next would change everything. He took a slow step forward, voice steady but firm. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the vehicle's owner. Judge Grayson frowned. The owner? Jalen nodded. Yes. Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the stolen Audi, gave a statement to the police. For some reason, it never made it into the prosecution's filings. I think I know why. He turned to Carrington. Do you recall what Mr. Whitaker told officers the night his car was stolen? Carrington's jaw clenched. He knew what was coming. Jalen didn't wait for him to answer. Instead, he pulled a printed transcript from his file and read aloud. I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off, but it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid. He was white. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Jalen held the paper up. This is from the original police report. The same report the prosecution never mentioned. He turned back to Judge Grayson. The arresting officer left this out of his testimony. The prosecution ignored it. And yet, they expect the jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even match the description of the real thief, am guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Carrington stepped forward, scrambling. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle. Jalen shook his head. No, I wasn't. His voice didn't rise, but it cut through the courtroom with precision. I was arrested blocks away from where the car was abandoned. I was walking home after getting snacks with my friends. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't running from anything. The only thing connecting me to this case is bad police work and assumptions. Judge Grayson exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. The case was falling apart fast, and everyone knew it. Jalen turned back to the jury. The real thief got away that night. Officers found a black kid in the same area and decided that was close enough. That's what this case is really about. Silence. Grayson cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. Does the prosecution have anything further? Carrington stood stiff, his face flushed. No, Your Honor. Judge Grayson exhaled, looking at Jalen, then at the jury. Finally, he leaned forward and spoke words that would stay with everyone in that room. Case dismissed. A beat of stunned silence, then chaos. Half the courtroom erupted, some in disbelief, others in quiet relief. The gallery stirred, reporters scribbling in notebooks. Jalen didn't move right away. He let the moment settle, allowing reality to sink in for everyone. Judge Grayson still held his gavel, his gaze fixed on Jalen with an expression that was hard to read. There was something new in his eyes. Recognition. Maybe even regret. Jalen met his eyes before turning to leave. Just as he reached the door, the judge spoke again. Mr. Dawson. Jalen stopped but didn't turn around. Grayson hesitated before finally saying, You should consider law school. Jalen smirked. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. Outside, the courthouse steps buzzed with noise. Reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing, microphones shoved forward like weapons. Jalen, did you expect the judge to dismiss the case? What's your next move? How does it feel to outmaneuver a seasoned prosecutor? Jalen pulled his hoodie over his head, ignoring them. He wasn't interested in the attention. This wasn't about proving his intelligence. It was about something bigger. At the bottom of the steps, his mother, Denise, stood waiting. Arms crossed, her face unreadable. She stared at him for a long moment, then finally shook her head and let out a breath. Boy, you scared me half to death. Jalen chuckled, scratching the back of his head. Had to take a risk, Ma. She studied him another second before pulling him into a tight hug. You always were the stubborn one. The cameras kept flashing, but Jalen didn't care about them anymore. Across the street, Judge Grayson stood by his car, watching. His posture had changed. The arrogance was gone. His face no longer amused. Instead, it held something else: reflection. He hadn't expected this case to be different. Just another day, another defendant, another guilty plea. But now, he knew this one would stay with him. Jalen had done what most couldn't. He made the system look at itself. And for once, it blinked first. Here's the real lesson. How many cases had played out like this? How many people convicted not because of evidence, but because of bias? Because of shortcuts? Because the system cared more about closing cases than seeking truth? Jalen had knowledge. He knew how to fight back. But what about those who didn't? This wasn't just about one case. It was about all of them. He knew his next step. This courtroom wouldn't be his last. But next time, he wouldn't stand there as the defendant. He'd be the attorney. And when that day came, he wouldn't be the only one. If this story made you think, even for a second, share it. The justice system is based on laws. Yet, it's operated by individuals. And individuals can evolve. But only when we push them to. Hit that like button, subscribe for more compelling stories, and let's continue the discussion. Because next time, it may not be Jalen. It could be someone close to you.